Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so excited to bring you this video today where I will be talking about the differences between asynchronous programming and synchronous programming, specifically looking at them through the lens of JavaScript, because this is the first video in a multiple part series where I will be deep diving into how can you implement asynchronous programming and JavaScript. So this video that you're watching right now, we'll talk about what is asynchronous programming, what is synchronous programming, and I have a tip for how you might remember the differences between the two. And then in future videos in this series, I'll be going into callback functions, promises, and async and await. So topics that cover how you might actually be able to introduce asynchronous programming into the code that you're writing. So with that, let's jump in. So synchronous programming might be what you refer to as standard programming. I like to think of it as sequential. Everything happens step by step, so the code gets executed line by line, top bottom, and it's pretty straightforward. So you can think of synchronous as straightforward. So let's take a look at a code example of some synchronous code. So as you can see here, we have some functions. We have a hello function and we have a goodbye function. They're just console logging some print statements. So with the synchronous programming, we have the code being executed in the order that it appears. So we call hello first. So in our console, we'll see hello first, and then we call the goodbye function afterwards, and then we see goodbye printed later. If you, for some reason, wanted to see goodbye first, we would just move that function one line before so that the goodbye function gets executed before the hello function, because synchronous programming goes step by step, line by line, boom, 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 boom. Now let's talk about asynchronous programming. So synchronous programming was very straightforward. Asynchronous programming is a little bit more interesting. So it allows the code to be executed outside of the order that it appears in the code. And it is very useful for a lot of real world scenarios that we will be getting into in just a second. But first I wanted to show a code example of some asynchronous code. It's very similar to the synchronous code example. We have our hello function, we have our goodbye function, but now we also have a new function that we put inside of a set time out. So set time out takes a callback function. We will have a future video on the callback function, which is just a function that allows you to implement asynchronous programming in JavaScript. That's all you need to know for right now, that this one line with the set timeout is some asynchronous code. And what's cool when we look at the order that these console statements are being printed out, we see that even though the set timeout is being called first, the print statement for it is appearing later on. So this is an example of the code not executing in the order step by step like we saw with the synchronous programming. This is a very simple example, but it kind of introduces you to this idea that code doesn't always execute in the order that it appears in the code. And the other thing I want to point out about this example is when you're dealing with asynchronous code, it's important that you realize it's asynchronous code, so that you realize that just because you put this statement before these other statements, that doesn't mean that it's going to finish or show up first. Asynchronous programming can depend, by the time it gets back to your code, it can really depend on what type of work it had to do before it can resolve or appear. So let's talk about some real world examples of asynchronous code. So now let's talk about some real world examples for why you might need to use asynchronous programming in your code. There are a lot of reasons. Like the first one that comes to mind are API calls. So let's say we had a weather app and we wanted to display the current weather and the current location for a user. The cool thing about it is because you need to talk to an API and before you can get the weather to come back, when you're using asynchronous programming, you have more control over the sequence that these asynchronous actions are firing off in. So we can go ahead and say, go and retrieve the weather, and once you have that weather, then display it. And that's important to be able to do that, because if we were to treat it like synchronous programming and having it go line by line, by the time we get to the line where we're trying to display the weather, we might not have heard back from the API yet. The API might still be working, finding everything in the database and getting it back to us. And so in that case, our user won't actually be able to see the weather. But if we know asynchronous programming techniques, we'll be able to make the API call, wait for it to resolve, and then show the user. And then the cool thing about the asynchronous programming is that while we're waiting on the API, we can go ahead and do other things in the code. And then once the API comes back to us with a response, then we can go ahead and process that response. So in a way, it's a way of being able to make our programs more robust and able to do more things. All right, so in my time teaching people how to code, it's very, very common to have some difficulties remembering what is synchronous programming versus what is asynchronous programming. So I have a little metaphor. I think it's a metaphor. It might be a simile. I think it's a metaphor on how you might be able to remember the differences. Okay, so I want you to imagine a kindergartner at school. This kid is in a class with other kids. The teacher welcomes them to class. Everyone sits down. They have reading time for a certain amount of time. And then after reading time, maybe they have a snack time. And then maybe after snack, the teacher gives out some sort of worksheet. The kids are working on an assignment. Even if the kid finishes first, the kid will have to wait and then until the next activity. So after they've done their worksheet, maybe it's time for lunch. So it's like a very sequential day. Now let's contrast this with a office worker, so an adult. Let's say somebody gets to work at 8 a.m. Maybe the first thing they do is they check their emails. Maybe they see that a colleague in a different time zone has emailed them, asking them a question, but maybe they don't know the answer yet. Maybe they need to go reach out to someone else before they can get back with this other person. So maybe they get this email asking for some information, and this person needs to go reach out to another person. So the adult, they'll send out the email to get the new information, but they're not going to wait until they receive this email before they go on and do something else. They're going to send off this email, and while they're waiting for a response, they're going to maybe check their Slack messages, maybe start working on a Jira ticket or a PowerPoint, whatever type of job this person might have. The point is, they're not going to just sit down and wait for a response because they're able to, while they're waiting for something, they're able to work on other things. And then once they do get a response back, then they'll be able to process that response and get back to the people who emailed them previously. And so this is an example of like asynchronicity, being able to, I don't know if that's the word, but like that represents asynchronous programming, because like the adult, they're not waiting for a sequence of events. They're able to stagger their work. They're able to multitask in a way while they're waiting for a response. While the kindergartner has much more of a sequential, synchronous day. with everything planned out step by step. Once one thing is done, they go to the next thing. So I hope that helps you remember the differences between synchronous and asynchronous, and I hope this video helps you know what is synchronous programming and what is asynchronous programming. So like I said at the beginning, this video is the first video in a multiple part series going deeply into how can you implement asynchronous programming in JavaScript. So the next video will be tackling callback functions. So we saw a little teaser of a callback function when we saw the asynchronous code example, but in the next video I will do a deep dive on what are callback functions, and then that will also help us in our understanding of other ways of implementing asynchronous programming JavaScript, which are promises and then the async and await built-in functions that came with the newer version of JavaScript. So that was a lot, but I hope this helps you understand asynchronous versus synchronous programming. I hope this video helps. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on these future videos in this series. If you have any questions, put them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. See you.